Welcome to another episode of Washington in Focus. I'm your host, Tim Klauser, with the Center Square's Washington State Capitol correspondent, Carlene Johnson, here to talk about the CEO of a Tacoma nonprofit being placed on paid leave amid an internal investigation, partially due to your reporting, Carlene, and that of Brandy Cruz, an independent journalist from Seattle, around several nonprofits, this one potentially included, misappropriating state taxpayer funds intended for this housing program. Why don't you give us some of the background context before we dig into this new edition?
No, absolutely. So a couple of weeks ago, we did our first article, and there have been subsequent ones. Our colleague, TJ Martinell, has also written a couple of articles as we started to unpack this. This goes back to a whistleblower, a real estate managing broker by the name of Corey Orvold. And she was a volunteer with the Tacoma Urban League, but was trying to get some of her clients access to taxpayer funds through some of these race-based housing programs, the Covenant Homeownership Program, which we've written about extensively, as well as the Community Reinvestment Program. This is a program. Whatever you think about these race-based programs, outside of that, there are hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars set aside for folks who, relatives of those who maybe were victims of housing discrimination policies of the past, or just from other minority groups that are kind of trying to get a leg up, whether it is a down payment for a home or investment to start a new business, maybe to pay off some student debt, that sort of a thing. So there's a lot of money set aside, and these nonprofits, the Seattle Metropolitan Urban League, the Tacoma Urban League, and many others that are getting millions of dollars from the Washington State Department of Commerce to then distribute to these minority groups in the community. So the first article that we did, and Brandy Cruz with the Undivided podcast also gained access to many of these documents from the whistleblower, Corey Orvold, showed that some of these folks that are in positions of leadership with the Seattle Urban League were giving some of these loans and some of the debt forgiveness, millions of dollars worth, to their inner inner circle, including family members. And we now have the Washington Attorney General Nick Brown's office is investigating the Seattle Urban League. And that was just kind of the tip of the iceberg, which, we kind of reported on in that initial article. There's a lot more to be uncovered. And this week's exposure of the Tacoma Urban League is the next chapter of that.
Yeah, it definitely seems like the iceberg is beginning to turn over with your TJ and Brandy's coverage on this in the past week or two. But interesting to see what's happening with the Tacoma League, because in that initial coverage, like you were saying with the Seattle Urban League, there was a lot of names put out, clients, the staff that were involved in potentially misappropriating those funds. You got comments from the AG's office and all that. But that's not so much the case here with the Tacoma Urban League, at least in terms of evidence on hand. I mean, I think it's very notable that the nonprofit has placed the CEO on paid leave and is acknowledging this internal investigation. But in that same step, they're saying, look, with this other story, you had all these specifics and those specifics aren't here. It's just a rumor. Can you expand on that a little bit more? What do they mean by it's just a rumor being thrown our way, considering everything else that's being unfolded with these other nonprofits?
So Desiree Wilkins Finch, CEO of the Tacoma Urban League, was in fact placed on paid leave last week. And then they put a statement out on the Urban League website, but they said any further inquiry, basically saying she's done great work for us. We know there's some questions out there. We've launched our own third-party investigation. They won't say whether or not the AG's office is investigating, and the AG won't tip his hand on that either. My speculation is that, in fact, the AG's office is also looking into the Tacoma Urban League, but they won't confirm nor deny that. But then they sent us to Dana Hill, PR, basically, for the Tacoma Urban League. And that you're right. Her sense was, while there might be all this evidence, named names, lots of people that there's evidence against for the Seattle Urban League, we don't have that for Tacoma Urban League. Well, the evidence is there, and some of it is already being uncovered. And we do have some additional documents that didn't have time to completely contribute for this last article, but it's there. The difference being with the Seattle Urban League issues, it was individuals, right, getting down payments for homes, getting debt forgiveness.
Family members, not just
Family
any
members.
individual, family
Right,
members of the
exactly.
people working there.
Right. And also the fact that they made a very close circle of lenders and agents that they were allowing to basically get a piece of the pie. It's like, okay, you've got somebody that might, be able to get access to these funds. You're going to have to use our lender. We're not going to use this guy here. We're going to use our realtor on this, not your realtor. And so those names and individuals are all spelled out. The difference with the Tacoma Urban League is they chose to use their $5 million that they got from Commerce this year to focus on minority business development. So rather than individuals for down payments for a house or debt forgiveness, they were doing it for, minority owned businesses. So then you had groups that were coming in, woman by the name of Noemi Kagaton Porter that I interviewed that runs a group called CJK Community Homes, and they work to put people in minority owned businesses. And they were at the very tail end of a process, having secured $1.5 million for these minority clients that were either, staying in business, maybe needed to pay off some debt, or opening a minority owned business in the Pierce County, Greater Tacoma area. She got to the end of this process where she's working with the Department of Commerce. She's working with the Tacoma Urban League. Everybody's in line. And all of a sudden she was ghosted. Very similar to what kind of happened with the Seattle Urban League and folks that thought they had secured access to funds for their clients. In this case, the same thing happened with Noemi, and the $1.5 million promised to her clients was suddenly gone. Now, where that went, who ended up getting it, that's going to be the next part that needs to be exposed. I know Brandy's been looking into this as well, and she's got another podcast coming out this week that might detail some more of that. But a lot of things to be exposed, a lot of folks that are asking, the right questions. And what was interesting is that Desiree Wilkins Finch, the CEO from Tacoma Urban League, who was placed on paid leave, she says she wasn't told why she was placed on leave, whether that's a truth or not, I don't know. She was texting me saying initially she was going to give me an interview and saying, well, tell me why I was placed on leave. And I'm responding to her saying, well, what did they tell you? Why were you placed on leave? The connection, obviously, to the bigger investigation about, these race-based programs is obviously it. And it was within a couple of days of our initial article coming out that she was placed on leave. So my guess is she knows. I don't know if her hands are clean in it or not. That'll come out in the investigation, but there's so much more here.
Yeah, really interested to see where that money ended up. And I'm sure that, probably all that money didn't go to one person or one business. But the question is, did it go to family members like in these other cases? And from the statement they gave you, it sounds like they're trying to push this and look, we're launching this investigation out of an abundance of caution. But at the same time, I know you said there's evidence that we're going to report on soon. But what we do know right now is that Corey Oldwald, the whistleblower, she worked with the Tacoma Urban League in addition to the Seattle Urban League. It's not like they're just lumped into this because they're a similar nonprofit. She was working there as well and then resigned as she started asking all these questions.
And she was just a volunteer, not a paid staff member. But for 8.5 years, Corey Orvold volunteered with the Tacoma Urban League and helped them build up some of these, sort of ground level programs. At the time, she told me when she started, They were doing things as, financial literacy for folks that maybe wanted to open a business. That's a minority member of the community. I've got this chunk of change from my grandfather that passed. I'm going to open a coffee shop. I really need some education in this. They set up those sorts of organizations to help folks get, whether it was schooling, whatever they needed to do, remedial education in some cases, so that they could have access to these funds. Because you do have to, it's an application like anything else, right? And you have to prove that you're probably going to be a good steward of those taxpayer dollars. So that's what she did with the Urban League. And she really believed, and she's half Black herself, which is not irrelevant. And the reason I say that, Tim, and I pointed this out in the article, and she told me this in the video that's linked with my article, she believes that the reason some of this stuff has not been covered by more mainstream media is because it's a sensitive racial issue. People don't want to touch it and go, wait a minute, you're saying something bad about these, about a minority program, and nobody's wanted to touch it. But now you've got members of the Black community speaking up saying, I was done wrong by my own community. And so then it becomes something that is undeniably, has to be exposed. But that is her sense in large part for why, because she's been trying to get people to pay attention to this since January of this year. And she went to Commerce, she went to the AG, she went to the state auditor's office, and nobody would pay attention to her. It wasn't until the evidence was so overwhelming and Brandy combed through the evidence and we started uncovering it as well that, people have started to pay attention. So it's good on people like her that have said, wait a minute, there might have been something really good here for community and you guys wrecked it, in her words, and it needs to be exposed. So I think that's why she's been so willing to put herself out there. It's cost her a great deal. It's costing her clients. It's costing her, she said, family members. It's, people are accusing her of being racist, even though she's a half Black woman, because she's coming out against these programs.
Well, a lot of sensitivity around these race-based programs, but I think when it really comes down to it, there's a different lens here, and that's that this is a taxpayer issue. There's hundreds of millions of dollars being doled out into this program that are supposed to be going towards this program, and I'll give it's a noble cause, but you have to make sure that it's being appropriated the correct way, and that's not what's being done. It's being doled out to family members, to people that work with these nonprofits, and they need to get a hold on it, whether that be through internal investigations, the AGO's investigations, and I'm sure we'll get more into that over the coming months, but media is a large part of that, and I will be really interested to see if some of the bigger outlets out of Seattle and Tacoma and other areas dig more into this as it reaches the light of day. But Carlene, we appreciate your coverage on this and everyone else that's contributed to it thus far. And for any of our readers hoping to catch some of that, you can read it at thecentersquare.com for current and future installments. But otherwise, thank you for joining us for another episode of Washington in Focus.